Let's reread the first part of our definition. Graphic design is the creation, selection, and organization of visual elements forming a visual language to effectively convey a message to an audience. Now, in the previous video, we talked about that message to an audience being an objective one. Taking a look at this first part of the definition, you can see that it says creation, selection, and organization of visual elements. And we take these visual elements and we use them to form a visual language. So this is communication, and it's really not that much different than other forms of communication, like I'm speaking, or even music, where in music you create and select and organize notes and instruments in a certain way to create a musical language. In English, as I'm speaking to you, I am creating, well, not really creating, but at least I'm selecting and organizing words in a certain way to form a sentence or form an audible language to convey my messages to you. So it is with graphic design. We have our own set of elements. We also have these things called principles, and those are the words and sentences that we use to communicate. Those are the notes and the instruments we use to communicate. What are those elements? Let's take a look. Here you see a list of principles and elements. Now, some graphic designers add more, some graphic designers have less, but these are essentially well understood elements and principles of graphic design. On the left-hand column, you see the principles: emphasis, hierarchy, unity, variety, depth, contrast, balance, movement, and pattern. On the right, you see the elements: space, line, shape, size, color, texture, value, typography. It's kind of like thinking about the elements sort of like you would think about words in language, and thinking about principles like you would think about sentences and paragraphs. We take these elements and we use them to create principles, not unlike using words to create sentences. We're going to take a look at a few samples of principles and elements in professional graphic design work. Before we do, I want you to know that we are just going to briefly cover and point out different principles and elements being used. We have a lot more on principles and elements coming later in the course. I also want you to know that any graphic design piece we look at is not going to just have one of the principles or one of the elements. They're going to be using a number of each. I'm only going to point out one or two of the principles and elements being used, but if you're observant enough, you're probably going to notice others as well. Let's take a look. In this one, you see space, you see contrast, black and white, you see lots of lines. And what are those lines doing? Those lines are producing motion. Here you see lines being used as well. You see contrast. You see a line down in the middle of yellow, which is different than everything else, color, and that's drawing your attention. Emphasis. In this piece, you see lots of lines and color being used, and probably the biggest principle here is motion. This is a web page, and you'll notice a lot of space is being used to bring us emphasis, and color is used to separate the two or contrast the two sides of this website. You see on the left, oh hello, you see on the right, the chair, and then lots of space. Here you see depth and dimension. Now, a lot of times people don't include that in the idea of a principle of design, but as you can tell, this is a two-dimensional space. It is a flat surface, yet that jar looks like it's 3D. That jar looks like it's coming off the page, and that causes us, it causes anyone looking at this to focus in on that jar, which of course is the principle of emphasis. And we sometimes call it a focal point. Here you see shape. obviously the shape of a heart. It's kind of an interesting way of doing it with fingerprints, and it's also got a lot of space around it. And if you notice, it's very well balanced. It's actually symmetrically balanced, the same on both sides. Here you see color and shape and contrast to create hierarchy and order. Hierarchy is what do you see first, what do you see second, what do you see third. Here we see shape, the shape of a human body, and that shape is communicating a lot to us. We can tell, or we respond, or we get an emotional feeling just by how that shape is standing. But that's emphasized because of all of the space. And then you see a contrast in colors, yellow and blue. The title's in blue, the shape's in blue, so those two things are areas of emphasis. Here you see typography and you see texture. Notice in the background, there's a lot of gritty, grainy texture. But also notice for a moment that that typography, the text inside the shape of the hand, also has a texture to it. So type, letters, can be used to create texture. Here, what you see is this repetition that gives us a feeling of texture, but it also gives us a feeling of pattern. And even this repetition has some motion in it as well. Here's an interesting piece because you see this pattern made by the squares or the rectangles of what appears to be a 35 millimeter piece of film. And so you get this feeling of this rectangular texture, but if you haven't already seen it, you take a step back and look at this, you're going to see the shape of a skull. Very interesting. Here you see shapes and you see space and you see contrast and you also see typography. But what's really nice about this is it has this rhythm to it. It has this repetitive movement. It almost looks like music. Here we see a contrast in size. Little dogs and a big dog. And they're looking at each other and they've got this sort of dynamic interaction going on. And that just is so interesting to the viewer. Anybody who looks at this is going to engage with this and feel a certain way. Here you see typography. Typography is used for almost this entire design. And typography happens to be one of the most difficult elements to master, but it is the most important, or at least one of the most important. Here you see a very effective way of creating action within the typography. With this piece, we see a few things like space, and we see balance, which is sort of off balance, more weight on one side than there is on the other. That's asymmetrical balance. But what I really want to point out to you is the hierarchy of this. Notice that we are sort of first drawn to her face, then we're drawn down to that purse, and then that purse, the corner of it, points over to the name. So the designer here is intentionally grabbing our attention and moving our eyes about the piece. This piece has space, obviously. It has balance. It's symmetrically balanced. But what I want to point out to you is that we are drawn towards the image in the center, which is a human being. And we, as human beings, tend to like to look at human beings. But there's also hierarchy here because she is looking down at the text, and so that draws our attention to the text. Now, there isn't a physical line between her eyes and the text, but we call that an implied line because she, with the line of her eyesight, is directing our next look. And finally, in this piece, you see a lot of color, you see a lot of motion, you see texture, you see space, you see shape. But what I want to point out to you is the word harmony or unity. Everything in this piece looks like it belongs together. That is a really important principle that we are going to have to learn as we do graphic design, is to make sure that every element we have, everything that we put into our design is there because it works with the entire piece. We call that harmony. We call that unity. Now, if it has too much harmony or too much unity, it becomes boring, so we need some variety too. And the trick is to find the balance between unity and variety. Now, let's just take a look at these simple shapes here so that I can share with you how these elements can communicate. These are graphic elements, and you see this little curved line and a red circle and a blue square. Now, right now, they're not communicating much. But remember in our definition, we talked about organizing elements in ways that form a visual language. Well, here, they're not really organized in a way that says anything. Notice that when they are reorganized in a certain way, it starts to communicate. Now, you might see a cherry on top of a square or a box, or you might see a red ball coming down from the sky that's going to bounce off of the box, but you see something. It's communicating to you, and it's the same elements we saw before. They're just rearranged in a different way. Here, same elements, rearranged differently, and now you probably see a box that's tipping down and going to smash the cherry or smash the ball. Point is, it communicates. It's giving a message just by reorganizing these elements. And it's giving a different message than the one we saw before. Now, I'm going to go through these next slides pretty quickly, but can you tell what that says? Because we're talking about communicating a message here. Can you tell what that message says? It says graphic design is visual communication. How about can you tell what this design says? What's the message here? Pretty funny, huh? Yep. Baby survived because of the car seat. Mom and dad didn't do too well. What about this message? Go in heavy, come out thin. Pretty creative. What about this message? I'll give you a hint. It's promoting fertilizer. The roots are really strong. What's the message here? Well, of course, these Sony headphones are really quiet, but it's done in a humorous way. In the next video, we're going to take a look at that second section of the definition.